Good morning and welcome to Heart Health. My name's Erin Harleton. I'm a registered dietitian with the Thames Valley Family Health Team. Let's get started. I'm going to skip through the first few slides because they're intended for a live audience. Let's talk about our outline for today and what we're going to cover in today's discussion. So first of all, we're going to look at what is cardiovascular disease and what might put me at greater risk. Then we're going to jump into exploring what does cholesterol or high cholesterol mean, and what about hypertension? Then we're going to look at how we can reduce our risk. And today in particular, in this conversation, we're going to be addressing dietary patterns. There is a part 2 of the Heart Health recording that will be led by one of our pharmacists, and the pharmacist will be addressing the remainder of the presentation. So please check that link out as well if you're interested in learning about alcohol and smoking, movement and exercise, medications, and so on. So first of all, what is cardiovascular disease? Cardiovascular disease is the world's #1 killer. As we can see from this infographic, it far outweighs any of the other leading causes of death around the world. When we talk about cardiovascular disease, we're actually referring to a group of disorders of both the heart and the blood vessels. Commonly, we refer to these as heart disease and sometimes stroke. Let's talk about a few of the risk factors that you may have for developing cardiovascular disease. First of all, high blood pressure. Next is an unhealthy diet. We can also have high cholesterol, which puts us at a greater risk. Diabetes puts us at a greater risk for cardiovascular disease. Overweight and obesity, in some cases, may put you at a greater risk. Smoking tobacco, air pollution, having kidney disease, physical inactivity, and harmful use of alcohol.
Cholesterol. It's essential to your well-being. But what do you really know about it? Let's start with the basics. What exactly is cholesterol? Well, it's a waxy, fat-like substance that's made in your liver and travels throughout your bloodstream. It's a key ingredient that your body needs to make new cells. But too much cholesterol can lead to serious problems, such as heart disease and stroke. Here's why. You see, there are actually 2 main types of cholesterol, LDL and HDL. LDL, or low-density lipoprotein, is sometimes called bad cholesterol because it can build up inside your arteries, which causes them to narrow, which can lead to heart disease or stroke. That's why you should try to keep your LDL low. Think of it this way. The L in LDL is for lower or lousy. On the other hand, HDL, or high-density lipoprotein, is the good kind of cholesterol. It carries LDL, the bad stuff, away from your arteries and back to your liver, where it's broken down and processed by your body. That's why you want your HDL to be higher. In this case, the H in HDL is for higher or healthy. There's actually a third component known as triglycerides, which plays a role in your cholesterol health. Triglycerides are the most common type of fat in your body, and their job is to store excess fat from your diet. Elevated triglycerides, along with low HDL and high LDL, can also increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, so it's important to keep your triglyceride levels low. For anyone who's had their cholesterol checked, it's only natural to focus on your cholesterol score or the actual numbers. But the numbers don't really tell the whole story about your health. That's why it's important to discuss all of your risk factors with your healthcare provider, including risk factors that you can change, like eating a healthy diet, getting plenty of physical activity, and quitting smoking. Controlling your cholesterol may be easier than you think, but it all starts with getting your cholesterol checked. It's a quick and easy test. So if you're due to have your levels checked, or if you never had them checked, make it a priority. Taking the next step in managing your health is as easy as CCC. Check, change, and control your cholesterol. Get started now by visiting heart.org/cholesterol.
Great. So I hope you enjoyed that little video, just of a recap of what cholesterol actually is. And I'm sure that some of you must have had a conversation with your physician at this point in time, possibly about your own numbers. And if you haven't, it's a really good thing to have those numbers checked, or to have your cholesterol levels checked in routine blood work with your doctor, just to see where you're at, to determine if that may be a part of your collection of risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Let's just take a little minute to recap what we learned in that video. So essentially, all the cholesterol that runs through our arteries is made in our liver. And this is often determined by our genetics, how much we might make of the LDL versus HDL. It's often contributed to by our lifestyle factors and also the components of our diet. So our body is going to be more likely to make more of those harmful cholesterols that tend to deposit in our arteries, such as LDL and triglyceride, if we have certain components in our diet that we are eating more of, which we are going to get into discussing in just a moment. On the flip side, those of us that tend to have less risk factors in terms of genetics and are also having more of a healthy eating pattern will tend to make more of the healthy cholesterol, or as the video had taught us, the HDL, or healthy, something to have more of. So whereas the LDLs and triglycerides will be released from the liver and they will circulate through our arteries and they tend to make deposits or fatty streaks, our HDL actually goes through our arteries and acts like a little cleaning crew, where it will start to mop up and carry away some of those cholesterol deposits, moving them back into the liver. So we want to have high HDL and low LDL and triglyceride. So that's just a brief look at cholesterol, and I hope that's helped to make things a little clearer for some of you. Let's move into the next risk factor that we discussed, which is hypertension. So hypertension is another word for high blood pressure. And again, just like cholesterol, some of you may be here today because your doctor has been monitoring your blood pressure and you've been asked to lower your blood pressure to lower your risk for cardiovascular disease. So what actually is hypertension and high blood pressure? Well, when our heart beats, it pushes blood through a network of tube-shaped blood vessels, including our arteries. When the force of the blood that moves through our arteries and vessels is too high on a consistent basis, we consider that to be hypertension. Now, why does hypertension even matter to our risk factors? Well, because if we have hypertension, high pressure in our arteries, it makes our heart work harder, and it also, over time, causes tears in the wall of our artery. The little tiny tears in our artery are rough patches where our LDL cholesterol can accumulate, and this over time leads to narrowing of the arteries. Now, hypertension is diagnosed differently depending on some other conditions that you might have, but most often the cutoff that the doctor will communicate to you will be 130/80. It's really important to know your numbers. So here we are with a little diagram of our artery and a little explanation of hypertension. So as we can see here on the left-hand side, the arrows pushing out indicates the pressure on the inside of our artery coming from the blood being pumped through. The number on the top, so for example, 130, it indicates the pressure in your artery when the heart has just pumped the blood through. So when it's really surging through with more pressure through your artery. And the number on the bottom is the pressure on the inside of your artery wall when the heart is at rest, so between beats. So that's what the two numbers mean. And again, the cutoff is shown here, anything over 130 and anything over 180. Now, as I said, this can change with age and other risk factors, and it can also change if you have other disease conditions that might put you at a higher risk. So really important to discuss with your doctor what your individual cutoffs are. So we've discussed cholesterol as a risk factor. We've discussed a little bit on hypertension and what that is and why that is a risk factor for developing cardiovascular disease. And now let's move into eating for a healthy heart. So the dietary risk factors. So when we talk about eating an overall heart healthy diet, we don't want to just say we have to eliminate a whole bunch of foods and carry on with our life living without certain foods and continuing just to narrow our options over time. We really want to see it as kind of a replacement or a push and pull. So some foods we are going to recommend that for a healthy heart, we want to have less of, but we also want to know how to replace those foods in our diet with healthier choices. So the push and pull really means that we want to have less animal fats in our diet, less fried food, less foods and beverages with added sugar, and less ultra-processed foods. When we talk about ultra-processed foods, we're essentially just kind of indicating those foods that are many steps away from their original form when they're harvested at the farm. So these foods tend to have fewer nutrients, less fiber, and more sodium. So those are the foods, generally speaking, that we want to have less of. The foods that we want to have more of in a heart healthy diet are plant, nut, seed, and fish oils, foods high in fiber, soy and vegetable proteins. So again, moving away from a lot of a meat focused or a meat protein based diet and moving more toward a plant protein focused diet. And also foods closer to their natural state, so the opposite of ultra-processed foods. So let's break down fats. So we used to think back, I think in the 90s, the big trend was if we had risk for heart disease or if we had high cholesterol and high blood pressure, we were just to completely go on a low-fat diet. And that really created a lot of opportunity for food marketing people to come through and create all sorts of foods where the fat was essentially removed, but then replaced with all sorts of other yucky things that actually may have even made us worse off. So we now know that it's not low fat necessarily that's going to benefit our heart the most. Rather, it's choosing the right fats. So again, looking at replacement rather than full removal. So what we want to have less of is saturated fats. So saturated fats will encourage our liver to make more of the LDL cholesterol. Saturated fats, generally speaking, are from animal products. So we can see at the little photograph here on the slide, we've got some fattier animal cuts. We also have higher fat dairy. So things like butter, things like high fat sour cream, creams that you put in your coffee, whipping cream, and even cheese. So these are the higher fat animal products, which we know to not be as heart healthy. In this category for saturated fats as well includes tropical oils such as palm and coconut oil. So these are the foods that have high content of saturated fat that we want to have less of. When we're looking at what types of fats and oils to have more of, we move toward the unsaturated fats, which are from plants. These are the oils that are typically liquid at room temperature, but they're also from foods that are not animal-based. So some high-fat plant foods are actually very heart healthy. And in this photo at the bottom here, we can see some examples such as olives, nuts, and seeds. We also think about things like avocado, and these foods are all quite heart healthy. So not only are those liquid oils healthy, but the plants that are also high in these plant oils or plant fats. So why do we actually care about saturated fat and what does it do? Well, we spoke just briefly before that it actually provides building blocks for your liver to raise LDL or produce more LDL, that sticky cholesterol in our arteries. Again, from the previous slide, and just to summarize, red meat, poultry skin, butter, fat from dairy products, and coconut palm oils is sort of where these fats live the most at the highest levels. So now that we know what fats to have less of and where the sources are, how do we actually and practically start applying that to our day-to-day lives and our day-to-day grocery shopping and meal preparation. So let's run through a couple suggestions for that. Number one, we can choose leaner meats, and that usually includes poultry, such as turkey and chicken, lean cuts of pork, such as the pork chop that you can trim the fat from, or a pork tenderloin are two very lean cuts of pork, and extra lean ground beef, or again, if we're looking to really lower the fat in our ground meats, we can switch to ground turkey or ground chicken in place of ground beef as well. Number two, we can choose fish more often to replace meat because the fat in fish is actually extremely heart healthy. So if we can even think about maybe replacing the meat at our dinner twice a week with a fish meal, that's very helpful as well. Number three, we can eat high fat meats less often. So again, looking at reducing regular ground beef, sausage, bacon, sandwich meats that like pepperoni, salami, bologna, and hot dogs as well. Number four, we can include more plant proteins. So replacing meat with legumes or soy-based foods, trying for about 2 meals per week. So thinking about perhaps we want to do something like a lentil-based stew or soup, or a patty, a bean-based patty instead of a hamburger on the barbecue. Trying to create something like a meatless chili where you're just relying on those legumes, so the kidney beans, chickpeas, etc., in that meal for the protein rather than the beef. So looking up some recipes where we're actually substituting those legumes for meat is going to be a very heart healthy choice. Number five on the list, and the final suggestion, is choosing low fat dairy products. So if you're drinking a higher fat milk, reducing that to 1% or skim, or even trying a milk substitute such as a soy beverage, which has the same protein as cow's milk, but does not contain very much of that saturated fat at all. You can, if you're a cheese lover like myself, you can choose a lower fat cheese. So we say the cutoff is about 20% or less to qualify that cheese as low fat. Or if you really love the flavor of a rich, sharp cheese, you can just reduce the amount of that cheese that you're eating. So just be kind of aware of where that cheese might be playing a role. Is it going on every sandwich? Is it being shredded into every recipe? Is it included in your salad? Are you doing grilled cheese? Are you melting it on your pasta? Are you having it as a snack in the afternoon with your crackers? So just maybe start by being aware of where you're using cheese, and is there a opportunity to start reducing that? Replacing some other high-fat dairy, such as using low-fat sour cream or lower-fat plain Greek yogurt. And also switching, if you're a coffee drinker, switching from a half and half, which is 10% fat, down to a 5% cream for your coffee, or even something like a homogenized milk or just regular milk. So sometimes we have to kind of reduce it gradually because we're used to the richness in our coffee, and switching straight from half and half to 1% milk won't cut it. So sometimes it's a gradual kind of weaning off of that richness in our coffee to get us to drinking it with something with far less saturated fat. And of course, we can't leave this topic without talking about the butter versus margarine debate. This topic is filled with many strong opinions, and I'm about to add my opinion to the conversation right now. So with all the data that we have around saturated versus unsaturated fat, we're starting to understand now that, you know, both butter and margarine, neither are perfect. And so my personal opinion is, if you have high cholesterol, switching over to margarine or just reducing both. If you are a hardcore butter person and say, I'll never eat margarine, then just have smaller amounts of butter. Again, just like cheese, taking a step back and looking at where might I be using butter, where I could switch to one of those plant-based oils. Am I frying my eggs in butter? Am I using it in a lot of baking? Am I using it, you know, to coat my cooked vegetables in the evening? So thinking about replacing that butter with an olive oil or another vegetable oil. And if you really need a spread, probably margarine is going to be a better bet, but reducing both of them is a good idea. So just taking a look How much am I consuming? Is there room to reduce either one? The other kind of bad guy when it comes to fat, and actually this is not probably, trans fats are actually even far worse than saturated fat when we are looking at our risk for cardiovascular disease. Trans fats are known to both raise LDL cholesterol and lower HDL cholesterol. So we're having fewer of our cleaning crew cholesterol and we're having more of our sticky, waxy cholesterol. Trans fats were banned from our food system in Canada a number of years ago. So it's now illegal for a manufacturer to use trans fats as an ingredient in the product. However, different types of processing foods will create trans fatty acids in just by way of their processing. And the primary or the number one way that trans fats are created in our foods today is by deep frying. So really when we're looking at the benefits of reducing deep fried foods, which we talked about on that first push and pull slide, we come back to that risk really being about the generation of trans fatty acids. So fried foods, something that we should just really have in moderation. Taking a look at your diet right now, how often am I consuming fried foods? Am I doing it every day? Is there room for some changes there? So we've started out by talking about those fats that actually will raise cholesterol, make our risk worse for cardiovascular disease. That includes the saturated or mostly animal-based fats, as well as the trans fats, which are made by deep frying. Now we get to move into that kind of other discussion around fats, of which fats are actually going to help improve our heart health or reduce our risk for cardiovascular disease, and which to include more of in our diet. So this is the group of unsaturated fats. So what do the unsaturated fats actually do when we increase them in our diet? Unsaturated fats help to lower our lousy LDL cholesterol. So when we shift our diet away from saturated fat and more toward unsaturated, it has this wonderful lowering effect on LDL. Now, it's not necessary to follow a low-fat diet to lower cholesterol. We need to follow the right fat diet by replacing saturated or animal fats with unsaturated fats. And we've included this sort of photo kind of example here, just to show how it might be a little easier than you think. So a typical kind of high saturated fat snack, 3 p.m. snack, might look something like some buttery crackers with some cheese. But if we just move that over to having a more kind of plant-based cracker, higher fiber, and we put nut butter on those crackers, it's probably about the same content of overall fat in both of those snacks. But the second example is very high in unsaturated heart-healthy fat, whereas the first example of the cheese and buttery cracker would be much higher in saturated fat. So sometimes it's not that we're trying to deprive ourselves, it's just that we're making those little lifestyle switches. Some more examples of foods that are high in unsaturated fats include olive oil, olives, nuts of all kinds, but particularly walnuts, seeds of kinds, and namely pumpkin seeds, flax seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds. Avocados are very high in unsaturated fats, as well as avocado oil, flax oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, and peanut oil. Now, the last and final fat that we will discuss, which really is sort of like a grand finale for our discussion around dietary fat, is omega-3 fats. Omega-3 primarily comes from fatty fish, but we can also get it from plant sources, which we'll discuss in just a minute. Why do we want to have more omega-3 fats in our diet when we're talking about our cardiovascular disease risk? Well, number one, it reduces triglycerides in our blood. We've spent a lot of time talking about LDL, but if you remember back from the video, triglyceride is that other type of sticky, waxy fat that circulates and can get kind of gummed up or built up in our arteries. Now, it also raises our good or our HDL cholesterol. So we get more of that cleaning crew moving through our arteries and tidying things up for us. And we also know that a diet that's high in omega-3 fats lowers overall body inflammation. When we are looking to see what types of fish are highest in omega-3 fats, we can remember the acronym SMASH: salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring. And I would add on to that trout. So like a rainbow trout is actually quite oily, and this is not an exhaustive list. It's just kind of the top ones that we know to contain the highest amounts of omega-3. Here's a slide that explains that yes, we can get our omega-3 in our diet from fish, but if you don't like fish, or if you are a vegan or vegetarian, we can also obtain these omega-3 fats from plant sources. Here in the photo, we have pictured flax seeds as well as walnuts and vegetable oils. So all three of those plant sources are high in omega-3. It's not the type of omega-3 that's as easily used in our body. So we just have to sort of keep an eye on that. We may need to eat more of those plant-based omega-3 sources to get the same benefit as we would from fish. What's the recommendation of how often we should eat fish? We should be eating 2 to 3 palm-sized servings of fatty fish per week to reach our recommendations or our requirements for omega-3 fats. Now, what if you don't eat the plant-based sources, and what if you do not like fish or you can't eat fish for whatever reason? So let's talk about supplementation. So the latest and most current and highest level of research is telling us that supplementation with the over-the-counter omega-3 product does not reduce major adverse cardiovascular events or death from all causes. So there has not been an association seen between supplementation and a lower rate of death from cardiovascular disease. However, if we do not eat the recommended 2 servings a day, or per week, that should say, of fatty fish, it is safe for most people to consume a supplement containing 1 gram of EPA and DHA. So those are the most absorbable and usable forms of omega-3 in your supplement. So you want to make sure that's on the label when you're purchasing an omega-3 supplement, because there may be other benefits from taking an omega-3 supplement, including, again, lowering inflammation and reducing triglycerides. So talking to your doctor, dietitian, or pharmacist would be a good idea if you have questions about omega-3 supplementation, and just seeing if it's right for you, because there are also medication interactions and it's not right for everybody. What about cholesterol in foods? So this is such a big source of confusion among people. I find when they are told their cholesterol is high, they start reading labels for cholesterol content in foods. But actually, the cholesterol that we eat or that we get from our food has very little effect on our blood cholesterol levels. Instead, we should be focused on having less saturated fat and trans fat in our diet. So we've gone through that pretty exhaustively. So, but just sort of hitting home the idea of really focusing on reducing saturated and trans fats and not really having to worry about the cholesterol in food. There is one exception to that rule, and that is if you have been diagnosed with a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, and that's pretty rare in our population, but in those folks, it does seem that dietary cholesterol has a bigger contribution to how much of that LDL that we produce. So what about eggs? I mean, again, I think probably about 20 years ago, eggs were the bad guy, and then we heard eggs were the good guy, and now nobody really understands what to do about eggs, but I sense they're starting to come back into people's diets, which I think is a really good thing. So the recent research is telling us that 1 egg a day is safe, even if we have high cholesterol, and up to 2 eggs a day is safe if we have normal cholesterol levels. So I'm always a little bit of a cautious person when it comes to just anything in excess. And so my recommendation is usually 1 egg a day is safe. If you want to be very cautious, you can tell yourself that 1 egg every other day is safe, but eggs are too nutrient dense to completely take them out of our diets unless we have another reason for avoiding eggs. so following a special diet. But if we are eating sort of an omnivorous diet, or even a vegetarian diet, eggs are incredibly important to include because of the nutrients in them that are really hard to get from other foods. So don't be afraid of eggs. It's the yolk that contains the cholesterol, not the white. So of course, you know, egg whites sort of, you can have as many of those as you want in a week, but the yolks, I would say, if you want to be very cautious, 4 to 7 a week. And that's the newest science on eggs. All right, so we are wrapping up our discussion around dietary fats and cholesterol. And now we are moving into a sort of different topic, but again, another really important dietary risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and that is sugar. How does sugar relate to heart health? Well, we know that a diet high in sugar can worsen inflammation in our body, including inflammation in our arteries. High sugar diets can also increase our triglycerides. But there's a couple different kinds of sugar, and we don't want to scare people away from, again, eating those nutrient-dense, important foods such as fruit. What we're trying to communicate is that we want to limit people from eating the foods that are high in added sugar. So there is a difference, and let's take a little look at that. So what we call natural sugar is found in food in its natural state. So it hasn't been added at any point in any of the food's life cycle. So examples of this would be fruit, some vegetables, cows or goat's milk, yogurt, or any dairy really. So that would be lactose is the sugar that is naturally contained in milk products. So these foods that contain natural sugar are part of a heart healthy diet. Sugar in its natural form is not known to increase the risk for heart disease. We do not need to be afraid of fruit, and we do not need to be afraid of the sugar in milk in relation to heart disease risk. Now, added sugar, on the other hand, the definition of added sugar is it's been added by food manufacturers or by us to the foods or the beverages that we consume. So some examples of added sugar is sugar sweetened beverages, including pop, iced tea, lemonade, Gatorade, baked goods, packaged foods and sauces, candy and confectionery, and even fruit juices. So our heart disease risk actually increases about 3 times for heart attack and stroke if a quarter or more of our daily calories or energy come from added sugars. And you might think, a quarter, that seems crazy. How would that even be possible to eat 25% of my energy from sugar? But sadly, it's not that impossible in today's food environment where sugar is just so prevalent in the foods that surround us. So something definitely to keep an eye on. Well, now that we know that sugar is a risk factor, and we know that it's really difficult to escape from added sugar because of our food environment, let's talk about how much added sugar is actually okay or safe. So this comes from recommendations from the World Health Organization, and we'll just walk through the different kind of ages and stages here. So for babies under 6 months, of course, no added sugar is the recommendation there. Children older than that until adulthood, we say 3 teaspoons per day of added sugar. Adult women and teens, we want 25 grams maximum, which is the equivalent to about 6 teaspoons of added sugar. And for adult men, it is 38 grams a day, or the equivalent to about 9 teaspoons. How do we know how much sugar is in our food? So let's just take a minute here and review how to find added sugar on the nutrition facts label on your foods and beverages. So here we have a can of pop. The first place that we want to look is the serving size. So we know that this label up at the top of the label, it says per 1 can. And about half to 2/3 of the way down, we can see that this label also contains a line that says sugars. Now the number beside that line is 42 grams. So 42 grams, if we want to remember the grams per day, that is considered safe. Women is 25, men is 38. If we consume this 1 can of pop, we've already exceeded those daily limits. Another really neat way of looking at sugar in order to be able to kind of really create a concept in our mind that's meaningful to us is divide that sugar gram number by 4, and that gives us the number of teaspoons. So for example, if I have this can of pop, I know I'm consuming 42 grams of sugar. 42 grams divided by 4 is 10.5. Sometimes when I'm doing these calculations, I just round the number so that it can be divided by 4 and get as close as possible. But this one here, 10.5 teaspoons a day. So in our minds, I'm a woman and I'm thinking I'm only supposed to have 6 teaspoons a day. And the manufacturer has added 10.5 in this 1 can of pop. That's too high. This is a beverage or a food that's going to increase my risk of cardiovascular disease if it's something I'm consuming on a regular basis. Okay, so that wraps up sugar, and hopefully that clears things up for people in terms of kind of, there's a lot of myth around sugar in the diet right now too, so hopefully that helps to clear things up a little bit. Now we are moving on to fiber, which is a really important part of an overall healthy diet. And the recommendations are laid out for us here on this slide. For men, we should be aiming for 35 grams a day. 10 grams of that should be soluble fiber. Soluble fiber has, we'll learn in the future slides, has a special relationship with cardiovascular disease. For women, we should be aiming for at least 25 grams of fiber per day. And of that, again, 10 grams should be from soluble fiber. Why do we talk about fiber when we're talking about cardiovascular disease? Well, because fiber actually has a powerful impact on lowering that LDL cholesterol. So soluble fiber is high in foods such as psyllium fiber, legumes, barley, oats and oat bran, oatmeal, some fruits, some vegetables, and flax and chia seed. We also have a photo here of Metamucil because Metamucil contains psyllium fiber, which again is one of the more powerful cholesterol lowering fibers. The other type of fiber in our diet is insoluble fiber. And although this doesn't directly lower cholesterol, the amount of insoluble fiber in a person's diet indicates that they're eating higher quality food. And it often can tell us whether that person is on track for the overall quality of their diet. It also helps to relieve constipation or prevent constipation. It's found in wheat bran, whole grain foods, whole fruits and vegetables. So the insoluble fiber is the kind that, doesn't kind of puff up if you were to put it in a glass of water, or what we might call the roughage in the diet. So that's a quick look at fiber. And now we are moving on to sodium or salt. So salt is something that we do need in smaller amounts throughout the course of the day. So it is an actual requirement. The trouble is that about 60% of Canadians get too much salt. And salt is something in our diet that can actually increase our blood pressure. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the different things we can do to increase or decrease our blood cholesterol, or LDL. And so salt impacts our risk for cardiovascular disease a little differently because it increases our blood pressure or hypertension. Eating too much sodium or salt will raise our blood pressure, so we know that to be a fact. Most of the sodium that we eat is already put in our food. So I've got this little kind of graphic on the right-hand side of the screen here showing some ways that salt is kind of hidden in the foods we eat. So we've got cheese, soy sauce, butter. We've got a little salt shaker here. Saltier meats, canned fish, canned vegetables, basically anything canned, and breads. I wish that I could put a boxed pizza on here, or a pre-made hamburger or hot dog, because these foods are also very high in sodium, but we'll leave it at that. So I always love to sort of help people understand how to read a label, because then really you have more power in decision making at the grocery store. So you don't have to guess anymore. You don't have to rely on manufacturers' claims on the front of the package, which can sometimes be very misleading. Understanding the nutrition facts label is very important for empowering you to know how to make those good decisions at the grocery store. So let's take a look at this label together, just as an introduction to help you become more comfortable with what you're looking for at the grocery store. So the first place we want to look is the serving size. So on this particular label, we have 125 milliliters, which for those of you who are bakers is a half a cup. We can see we sort of have arrows in all of the different spots on this label to point out some of the important things you might be wanting to look at. Saturated and trans fats down here, we can see the arrow pointing to that again, lowering those as much as we can in our diet because they increase risk for cardiovascular disease. We have an arrow pointing at sodium, which is important, and we'll get to a practical example of that in just a second. Fiber we know to be important. We've also discussed sugar. And then, of course, the label pointing downward is looking at percent daily value, which we'll describe in just a moment why that's important. Let's look at specifically finding sodium on a label. And I apologize, this isn't as clear as the previous label, but hopefully you can read it as well as you need to. So first of all, we're going to look at the top, and what is this label referring to? What is the serving size? It's 2 slices. So I'm going to assume this is maybe bread. When I'm concerned about cardiovascular disease, I'm going to scan down first of all and look for saturated and trans fats. Now I can look at the gram number, but it's really difficult to remember all the different gram recommendations in my head when I go to the grocery store. So if I move over from the gram numbers for saturated and trans fats, I can see that 2 slices of this product gives me 2% of my saturated and trans fats for the day. So I sort of describe this percent daily value as a bank account. And every day you have 100% in your bank account. Each time you eat a food that contains saturated and trans fat, you deduct from that bank account. So if I'm eating 2 slices of this bread, I still have 98% in my bank account for the rest of the day. So if I'm concerned with saturated and trans fats, this bread is actually a good low saturated and trans fat choice. Let's move on to fiber. So fiber is a couple lines lower than the saturated and trans fat. If I move over from that 3 grams, I can see that 2 slices of this bread contains 11% of my day, my daily needs. So again, with fiber, instead of counting down, we're trying to get more of it. We are counting up. So I'm trying to get to 100% in the day. If I eat 2 slices of this bread, I will be at 11%. So I still have to get about 89% for the rest of my day. Moving down to sodium, again, best thing to do is use the percent daily value column. It gives us an idea of how much we have left in our bank account. We start out with 100 for the day for sodium, and we count down. If I eat 2 slices of this bread, I will still have 91% to spend in my bank account. So although 200 milligrams might seem like a high number to me, I know that I'm actually only spending 9%. So it's kind of a good sodium bargain. Another way that people will use to determine whether there is a nutrient on the label that has a lot or a little is just looking at whether it's under 5% or over 15. So for example, if I'm choosing a cut of meat that has 25% saturated and trans fat, I will determine in my brain that that is over 15%, and therefore it is a lot. It is a higher source of that nutrient. If I'm choosing bread and the sodium is less than 5%, I will determine that that is a very little amount. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to always stay under 5%, because we can get a little obsessive if we put these real firm kind of cutoffs in our mind too. So we remember, I think the better way to remember it is just thinking about building up to 100% when we're looking at fiber, and counting down or deducting from 100% every day when we're looking at things like saturated and trans fats and sodium. Here's a label comparison of, we've got cracker A and cracker B. So we can see here in this comparison just how labels differ quite a bit. Paying attention to the serving size, first of all, we can see that the cracker on the left-hand side has twice the serving, 9 crackers versus 4 crackers. Looking down to the saturated and trans row that we have highlighted, we can see that cracker A has a much higher sort of cost for saturated and trans fats than cracker B. I can also see that it has a much higher sodium cost than cracker B. And I can also see that I'm not getting as much fiber than cracker B. So I might want to consider that cracker B might be a better choice for me, but I also want to consider that the serving sizes are not exactly the same. So just something to consider there. Still, if I was looking at reducing my risk of cardiovascular disease, I would choose cracker B. And I hope that you would do the same. Oh, we all need to take a deep breath and kind of take a minute to let all of that information sink in. There's been so much discussed. We've gone everything from, the bad or the more cardiovascular risk fats to the less risk fats, or reducing your risk with fats. We've talked about fiber, we've talked about sugar, we've talked about sodium, and probably a lot of your heads are spinning right now. The good news is that we have boiled down all of these guidelines into sets of dietary patterns that seem to be really linked with lowering risk. So sometimes, instead of following all these numbers in your head, following or sort of adopting a dietary pattern can be a good way to reduce your risk as well. So let's take a look at a few different dietary patterns that have good science behind them for reducing risk for cardiovascular disease. The first we want to talk about is Mediterranean diet. So by far the most studied dietary pattern around the world when it comes to its link with cardiovascular disease. So here's the Mediterranean diet pyramid. We can see if we're starting at the bottom of the pyramid and working our way up, the sections at the bottom are larger, meaning they're the things that we need to be doing every day or including every day. So the second section up, we can see that this diet is very rich in daily consumption of whole grains, fruits and vegetables, herbs and spices, olive oil, nuts and seeds. We can also notice about this section of the pyramid that it's very rich in color and a lot of different color. So this is a really important aspect of the Mediterranean diet pattern. The next box up, we can see that we're looking at a focus on fish and seafood. Again, going back to those powerful omega-3 fats for reducing our risk for cardiovascular disease. The next block up, we're looking at poultry, eggs, cheese, and dairy products. So we want to eat these weekly, so we can eat them several days a week, but we want them to be in moderate portions. So again, just as we were discussing cheese, it doesn't mean you have to completely throw out cheese. It's looking at just paying attention to your portions of these foods. Same with eggs. Maybe eggs are not unlimited. We can still include them. They're very nutrient dense foods. We just have to pay attention to how many we're having throughout the course of the week. And then at the very top of the pyramid, we have meats and sweets. So we're talking about red and processed meats, and also sweet foods or treats. I would also put the ultra processed foods up here. So those treat foods that sometimes, you're going to occasionally bring into your cupboards that are actually more processed. So they'd be included in the top of this pyramid. And we just say less often. So that's an individual thing. Does that mean, I'm still going to have that treat, in the afternoon, 3 days a week, but I'm just going to really have a small amount of it? Or maybe you're coming from a place where, you're having a lot of those foods each day. And for you, it just means having slightly less. So maybe I'm going to have slightly less ice cream after supper at nighttime, and I'm going to work my way toward just having maybe fruit in the evening instead. So it's individual for everybody, but if we're looking at people who follow this particular pattern, we know that there are great outcomes for reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. The next diet that we have good science behind focuses specifically on lowering LDL cholesterol. So this diet is called the portfolio diet. And the main features of this diet is it's more plant-based or vegetarian. The focus is on a lot of nuts every day. So 50 grams daily, which is like a big handful. We want to have lots of soluble fiber. So even exceeding the amount that we talked about recommending in the previous slide, up to 25 grams a day. So that powerful cholesterol lowering effect of soluble fiber. Foods that are high in plant sterols. So there are a lot of fortified foods out there. Actually, not a lot. There are a few fortified foods with plant sterols, but also there's supplementation. And then plant proteins. So again, moving away from the animal proteins to plant proteins. And we did discuss a few of those examples, but here they have tofu, legumes, that's edamame, and I think that might be a soy-based milk on the right-hand side of that graphic there. So lots of benefits for your heart from this diet. The main one that has been studied is lowering LDL. And then the last diet has been studied specifically for reducing blood pressure. So this is called the DASH diet. So the DASH diet is pretty similar to the Mediterranean diet with a few little differences. There's a larger emphasis on daily dairy product consumption in this one. So pretty close. If we're looking at the way that this kind of pie chart is laid out there, we can see a lot of similarities, right, between this one and Mediterranean, but a bigger part of the pie is being dedicated toward dairy. So of course, we're looking at low fat dairy. We don't necessarily want the saturated fat that comes from dairy, but the lower fat dairy products, a lot of emphasis on fermented dairy as well. Things like kefir, things like yogurt, things like aged cheeses. But the recommendation is 2 to 3 servings of dairy product every day. We want to have lots of fruits and veggies in the DASH diet, 8 to 10 servings a day of fruits and vegetables, and then focusing grains on whole grain as much as you possibly can, which is also going to increase fiber in your diet, which we know to be very heart protective. When we look at the protein section of this, very similar to Mediterranean diet, my eye immediately goes to the fish, and then it kind of wanders around and notices that there's chicken and notices that there's eggs, but definitely a great emphasis on the fatty fish. And then we see that tiny little piece of the pie, which is fats and sweets, and just limiting those similarly to the Mediterranean diet pyramid. So these are the diet patterns that if our brain is very confused at all the different kind of specific recommendations in the first part of the presentation, and you just want someone to hand you kind of a diet plan, picking any one of these diet patterns will be very cardio or heart protective. So that would be a good choice. So folks, that wraps up today's recording of the Heart Health presentation, part 1. I hope that you found it informative. I always encourage the people that attend the presentations to just see if you can pick 1 or 2 action steps from what you've learned today that you really feel like are doable, that you could even start today or tomorrow. And just being consistent with those changes over time and not dumping a whole bunch of expectation on yourself right off the bat, but starting with small changes and building on those, you're far more likely to succeed long-term with those changes. So I'm wishing everybody good luck, and thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and all the best in health. Thank you.